She was born into a world most people couldn't imagine. Private islands, a personal yacht with gold-plated fittings, dolls dressed in Christian Dior, ponies gifted by the King of Saudi Arabia. She would eventually command one of the largest privately owned shipping empires on the planet, and she would spend every day of her adult life searching for something that all of it couldn't buy. This is the story of Christina Onassis, the woman who inherited a $1 billion empire and whom 4 marriages still couldn't save from loneliness. The world she was born into. Christina Onassis came into the world on December 11, 1950, in New York City, at the Leroy Sanitarium in Manhattan. Her father was Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate who had arrived in Argentina as a penniless immigrant in the 1920s and built himself, through a combination of relentless drive and a genius for knowing what the world needed before the world knew it, into one of the wealthiest men alive. Her mother was Athena Mary Livanos, known as Tina, a Greek socialite whose own family had built one of the most powerful shipping dynasties in the world. Both sides of Christina's family were Greek maritime royalty, and she arrived into their union as their second child, after her older brother Alexander. The family's yacht, the Christina, a 325-foot vessel her father had named after her, was one of the most famous private ships on Earth, fitted with old master paintings, gold-plated fittings, and a mosaic dance floor in the style of an ancient Greek palace. The bar stools in the yacht's lounge were upholstered in the skin of a sperm whale's teeth. The swimming pool converted into a dance floor at the touch of a button. Winston Churchill cruised aboard it. Prince Rainier and Princess Grace Monaco visited. Frank Sinatra performed there. Their private island, Skorpios, purchased by Aristotle in 1963 and transformed at enormous expense into a private paradise, was a rocky, verdant Ionian retreat that the family treated as their most intimate retreat. Christina grew up launching tankers at the age of 2, her tiny hands pushing the champagne bottle against the bow of a 45,000-ton vessel in Hamburg. The King of Saudi Arabia gave her father ponies. Those ponies became Christina's. Her dolls wore dresses designed by Christian Dior. But from the very beginning, the comfort was more visible than real. Aristotle Onassis was almost never home. He was a man who operated on a global scale, negotiating tanker contracts in one city, entertaining princes in another, conducting the relentless business of an empire that never stopped demanding his attention. He had not built what he built by being present at breakfast. Tina was a socialite in the truest sense, more at home on the international party circuit than in any one place her children might have come to think of as permanent. And so Christina and Alexander grew up shunted between schools in different countries, shuttled between apartments and estates across Paris, Athens, Antibes, Monte Carlo, and New York, with visits from their parents that were significant occasions rather than ordinary daily life. Aristotle called Christina his golden one, and that golden warmth was real when it was present, but it was not reliably present. And children, especially children as sensitive as Christina turned out to be, notice the difference between love and its occasional substitutes. Christina was educated at the Hewitt School in New York, then at the fashionable Swiss finishing school St. George's College in Lausanne, and briefly at Queen's College in London. She grew up speaking multiple languages and knowing the right forks to use at any dinner table in the world. She also grew up with a persistent and damaging sense that she was not quite what the world around her required her to be. She was tall for a girl of her generation, 5'9", and she had inherited her father's dark, striking Mediterranean features rather than her mother's slender, blonde beauty that turned heads in every European capital. She was aware of the difference. She was aware of it in the way that children who grow up in extraordinarily glamorous surroundings tend to be aware of their own perceived shortcomings. acutely, constantly, and without mercy. She would struggle with her sense of her own appearance throughout her entire adult life, cycling through extreme diets that would produce dramatic weight loss, followed by equally dramatic weight gain. Driven by a relationship with her own body that had been complicated by comparison from childhood onward. The marriage that had produced her began to crack when she was still a young child, driven by her father's long and deeply public affair with the opera singer Maria Callas. The divorce was finalized in 1960, when Christina was 9 years old. She had expected her parents to reunite. They did not. And the affair with Callas, which the press covered with the enthusiasm they brought to any collision between enormous wealth and operatic genius, became something Christina would carry as a personal grievance for years. She was convinced that Callas had destroyed her family. The reality, which she came to understand only gradually and perhaps never entirely, was that her family had been troubled long before Callas arrived. What happened next, when her father decided to remarry, would shake her in ways she never fully recovered from. And what happened in the years that followed would take everything she had left. Jackie Kennedy and the family she lost. In 1968, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated American president. The marriage was one of the most talked-about unions of the decade. The world's most famous widow and one of the world's richest men, joining their respective legends in a ceremony on the island of Skorpios that the press covered as though it were a state occasion. Christina and Alexander had both pleaded with their father not to do it. Their objections were consistent and heartfelt. They distrusted Jackie Kennedy, believed she was primarily interested in their father's money, and resented the way the marriage restructured the Onassis family's public identity around a woman who was a stranger to them. Christina's private description of her new stepmother, calling her her father's unfortunate obsession, captured a feeling she maintained without softening for the rest of her life. The relationship between them was cold in the way that relationships between powerful people who are required to share public space often become: formally correct, privately antagonistic. The marriage changed Christina in a way that went beyond the personal. Jackie Kennedy's presence in the Onassis world brought an intensified and unrelenting press scrutiny to everyone connected to the family. Christina had always been photographed and discussed. She was an Onassis, after all. But now she was also the stepdaughter of the world's most photographed woman, and the cameras found her everywhere she went, whether she was doing anything worth photographing or not. Then, in January 1973, Alexander Onassis was involved in a plane crash near Athens while helping to train a new pilot in the family's amphibious aircraft. He was 24 years old. He suffered catastrophic brain injuries and never regained consciousness. He died on January 23, 1973. He was the person Christina was closest to in the world, her brother, her childhood companion, the one who had shared the particular experience of being an Onassis child in all of its impossible grandeur and its genuine loneliness. His death devastated the entire family. But for Christina, it was something more fundamental. It ended the one relationship in her life that had never been complicated by money or ambition, or the social transactions that governed everything else. Aristotle Onassis never recovered from losing his son. He had been grooming Alexander to eventually take over the empire, and with Alexander gone, he turned to Christina, began training her, bringing her into his business travels, introducing her to the people who ran the shipping world. She was quick and she was serious, and she absorbed what he taught her. But the father who was training her to take over was not the same man who had built the empire. He was diminished by grief, consumed by dark suspicions that Alexander's death had not been an accident. He became increasingly erratic. His health deteriorated. In 1974, Tina Onassis died in her Paris apartment. She had been married, since 1971, to Stavros Niarchos, Aristotle's most bitter business rival, and also the widower of Tina's own sister, Eugenie, who had died years earlier under circumstances that those who knew the family found troubling. Tina's death was attributed to pulmonary edema following an overdose of barbiturates. Christina was convinced the circumstances were not as they appeared. She demanded an autopsy. She went to the press with her suspicions. Niarchos retaliated by releasing information to the newspapers about Christina's own mental health struggles, and by claiming that her confrontational behavior had contributed to Tina's decline. It was one of the ugliest episodes in a family whose history contained a great many of them. Aristotle Onassis died in Paris on March 15, 1975, at the American hospital of Neuilly-sur-Seine, of pneumonia following gallbladder surgery. Christina had refused to leave his bedside during his final weeks. She had, by multiple accounts, arranged for Jackie to be kept in New York until the very end, ensuring that when her father died, the only family member present was her. She was 24 years old, and she had lost her brother, her mother, and her father within 29 months. A person who had met barely a decade of adult life had been stripped, in less than 2.5 years, of every member of her immediate family. In the aftermath of his death, overwhelmed by grief and the weight of everything she was now carrying alone, Christina went through a period of acute crisis at the hospital. An alert member of the medical staff intervened and ensured she was safe. The episode was kept out of the public record as quickly and completely as the Onassis name's influence could manage, and that influence was still considerable. But those close to her knew what had happened, and the darkness it pointed to would shadow everything that followed. What followed, immediately and practically, was the business of an empire. Aristotle had left approximately 55% of his estate to Christina. The estimated value was somewhere between $400 million and $1 billion, depending on how you valued the tanker fleet and the other holdings. The remaining 45% went to fund a foundation established in Alexander's memory. The Alexander S. Onassis Foundation would go on to become one of the most significant arts and education philanthropies in the Greek world. Christina would spend the next 13 years running the commercial empire, while the foundation ran itself separately. She also had to deal with Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who contested the will and sought the widow's share she was entitled to under Greek law, potentially as much as $125 million. Christina negotiated that figure down to $26 million and bought her stepmother out entirely, ending the legal connection between them. It was sharp, efficient work for a 24-year-old in grief. It was also, characteristically, the kind of outcome that those who had written her off as simply an heiress with more money than substance found impossible to explain away. Jackie Kennedy contested Aristotle's will, claiming the widow's portion she was entitled to under Greek law, which could have amounted to as much as $125 million. Christina negotiated a settlement of approximately $26 million to make her go away. It was considerably less than Jackie might have received, and considerably more than Christina wanted to pay. The negotiation was sharp and unpleasant on both sides. It was the last major business transaction between them. What Christina inherited from her father, aside from the grief, was approximately 55% of his estate, then estimated at somewhere between $400 million and $1 billion. She also inherited the responsibility of running Olympic Maritime, the tanker company that was the heart of the empire, and which required decisions of extraordinary complexity and scale every day it operated. She was 24 years old, recently bereaved, and by her own description, entirely alone in the world now, and she had 4 marriages ahead of her. Husband 1, Joseph Bolker, the American she ran toward. The first marriage had already happened, before all the deaths, before the inheritance. Christina married Joseph Bolker in Los Angeles on July 26, 1971. She was 20 years old. Bolker was 47, a divorced Los Angeles real estate developer with 4 daughters of his own. He was 27 years older than the girl he was marrying, which was significant enough that even in an era accustomed to considerable age gaps in wealthy families, it attracted considerable comment. Bolker was, by Christina's later account, someone she had run toward rather than someone she had chosen in any considered sense. She had met him in Monte Carlo. She was young, restless, starved for affection that her parents were constitutionally unable to provide, and searching for something, someone, who would hold still long enough to be held onto. Bolker was attentive, warm, and genuinely fond of her. At 20, that may have been sufficient. Her parents were united in their opposition, which was one of the very few things they agreed on by that point. Aristotle was furious. He had plans of his own for Christina's romantic future, plans that involved the Greek shipping world and appropriate dynastic alignment, not a middle-aged American real estate man from California who had nothing to do with any of it. He exerted pressure. He made his displeasure known. He reportedly threatened to disinherit her. The marriage lasted 9 months. Whether its end was primarily the result of Aristotle's pressure, the gap between who Christina was at 20 and what a marriage to a man twice her age required of her, or simply the fundamental incompatibility of 2 people whose worlds were so different that living inside a shared one proved impossible. All 3 were likely true in some proportion. The divorce was finalized in 1972. Within months, she was in Monaco, working as a secretary in her father's headquarters. It was her first serious engagement with the business that would eventually belong to her, and by most accounts, she approached it with the seriousness it deserved. She was smart, she was observant, and she had inherited her father's social intelligence, the ability to read a room, to understand what people wanted, and to navigate accordingly. But the professional life, as absorbing as it was, could not fill what the marriage had failed to fill. The grief years came next. And when the grief years were over, and she had inherited everything, she married again almost immediately, this time to someone she had been encouraged to see as the appropriate Greek choice. Husband 2, Alexander Andreadis, the arranged disaster. Alexander Andreadis was everything Joseph Bolker had not been, at least by the social metrics that governed the Greek shipping world. He was Greek. He came from a wealthy Greek shipping and banking family. He was young, essentially the same age as Christina. He was the kind of match that made sense on paper, which is to say the kind that the people around Christina had been pushing for since she first started attracting attention. They married on July 22nd, 1975, barely 4 months after Aristotle's death. Christina was grieving, newly in possession of an empire she was still learning to run, and surrounded by advisors and social pressures, and a culture that had very clear ideas about how a Greek heiress was supposed to behave and who she was supposed to marry. The marriage lasted 14 months. It was, by all available accounts, an arrangement that suited the expectations of the people around them more than it suited either of the 2 people inside it. Christina later described her second husband with a notable absence of warmth, which was perhaps the most telling thing about how the experience had registered with her. The connection that hadn't been there at the beginning did not develop. They were 2 people performing a socially sanctioned role, and when the performance became too exhausting to maintain, they stopped performing it. The divorce went through in 1976. Christina had now been married twice and divorced twice before she was 26 years old. She was also, by this point, managing an empire valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, making decisions every day that affected thousands of people and millions of tons of shipping tonnage across the world's oceans. She negotiated contracts with governments and with multinational oil companies. She bought and sold tankers. She fought off challenges from her father's old rivals, who thought a young woman would be easier to outmaneuver than her father had been. She proved them wrong, repeatedly and sometimes brutally. But the private life remained unresolved. And the third marriage, when it came, would be unlike anything that had come before it, producing a scandal that crossed the Cold War and made headlines across Europe in a way that even a woman named Onassis hadn't quite generated before. Husband 3, Sergei Kauzov, the Russian, the Cold War, and the world's raised eyebrows. In 1976, Christina Onassis chartered 5 bulk carriers to a Soviet shipping agency called Sovfracht, valued at approximately $30 million. This was, in itself, notable, and not just commercially. The Cold War was in full force, and the idea of the heiress of the Western world's most powerful, privately owned shipping empire doing significant business with the Soviet Union attracted immediate and intense attention from the press, from her own advisors, and from the Western governments whose shipping industries watched the Onassis name for signals about market direction. It was also, by several accounts, where she first encountered Sergei Kauzov. He was a Soviet shipping agent, an employee in the Byzantine commercial architecture of the Soviet state. He was handsome in a particular way, physically imposing, with the kind of self-possession that comes from existing entirely outside the social world Christina normally occupied. British newspapers, with a Cold War tabloid logic that required very little evidence, immediately reported that he was either a KGB agent or operating under KGB instructions. This was never conclusively established. What was established was that Christina Onassis, one of the most famous capitalists in the world, and a Soviet government shipping agent, had met in the middle of a tanker negotiation and produced, within a relatively short period of time, a wedding. They married on August 1st, 1978, in Moscow. Christina Onassis was now living in a Soviet apartment, ordinary Soviet housing, not the kind of luxury that had surrounded her since birth, but a standard apartment in the city where her husband was stationed. She stood in the ordinary queues at markets. She lived in rooms that bore no resemblance to any of the places she had previously called home. She had no entourage, no private island, no yacht, no staff moving discreetly around her to ensure she was never inconvenienced by ordinary life. By the accounts of those who knew her during this period, she was, for a brief time, genuinely happy, or at least genuinely distracted, which in Christina's case sometimes served a similar function. The simplicity that the Soviet arrangement imposed on her was something she had never had access to before, an existence that had been stripped of the performance of wealth. She also paid for a house outside Moscow for herself and Kauzov, using her own funds, a gesture that attracted commentary in the Western press, as it seemed to represent an extraordinary act of personal investment in a situation that many observers considered deeply impractical. But the Soviet adventure did not last. She eventually left Moscow. There were reports that Kauzov followed her to the west. They attended parties together on Scorpios, which produced photographs that circulated in European newspapers under headlines that speculated about KGB access to the Onassis island. The marriage, by most accounts, had run whatever course it was going to run within about a year of its formal beginning, and the divorce was finalized on May 8, 1980. Christina reportedly gave Kauzov a ship as part of the settlement, an act of generosity that was also, characteristically, an act of finality. It was over, and she intended it to be cleanly over. For Christina, the Kauzov marriage represented something she would not have been able to fully articulate, but that everyone around her could see. She was not choosing partners, she was choosing escapes. Each marriage was a door she opened, not because she knew what was behind it, but because it led somewhere other than where she was. The succession of failures was not changing the pattern. Each new marriage only confirmed it. The fourth marriage would be the last. It would also be the one that gave her the thing she had wanted most, and then took almost everything else. Husband 4, Thierry Roussel, the love, the child, and the betrayal. Thierry Roussel was French, 31 years old, and the heir to one of France's largest pharmaceutical fortunes, the Roussel Pharmaceutical Group, a major European company, when he married Christina Onassis on March 17, 1984. He was tall, blonde, and elegant in the way that certain wealthy European men of that generation were. A kind of easy, unhurried confidence that came from never having been required to prove anything to anyone. Christina appears to have fallen for him with a completeness she had not brought to any of the previous 3 marriages. She spoke about him to friends with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely believes, this time, that they have found what they were looking for. She was not going through the motions. She was not fleeing. She was actually choosing. She was 33. She had been married 3 times. She had inherited and continued to manage an empire. She had been photographed and scrutinized and discussed for her entire adult life, and she had learned to deflect most of it with an armor of wit and social fluency that people who encountered her in social settings often found genuinely charming. But she had also, by this point, been formally diagnosed with clinical depression, a diagnosis made in her early 30s that resulted in prescriptions for barbiturates, amphetamines, and sleeping pills, which she had been taking with increasing dependency for several years. She was managing an extraordinary amount, and not all of the management was working. What she most wanted, in the years leading up to the 4th marriage, was a child. She had said so plainly, and to people she trusted. The longing was real and specific. She wanted to be what her own parents had largely failed to be, which was present. She wanted a family of her own making, built the way she would have wanted to be raised, with the daily ordinary contact that wealth and the demands of dynasty had always prevented in her own childhood. She had that child. On January 29th, 1985, Christina Onassis gave birth to a daughter at the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, outside Paris. She named the girl Athena, after her own mother. The birth was, by multiple accounts, the moment of greatest happiness in her adult life. She was photographed leaving the hospital, beaming in a way that people who had known her for years said they had never quite seen before. She devoted herself to Athena with the intensity of someone who had found, at last, the relationship she had been looking for since childhood. An uncomplicated love, a clear purpose, a reason to be present that didn't require any of the transactions that governed everything else in her world. She said at the time that she would happily give up everything for her daughter. People who heard her say it believed her. But Roussel had been conducting a sustained relationship with a Swedish model named Marianne Landhage, known as Gabby, throughout the marriage. This was not a brief indiscretion. Landhage had already borne Roussel a son before Athena was born, and she bore him another child during the marriage. The situation was, in its essential architecture, a parallel family. Roussel moving between the two, with Christina's extraordinary wealth financing the life on her side of it, and the arrangement proceeding for long enough that it had become something resembling a structural feature of his life rather than a passing complication. When Christina discovered the full extent of what had been happening, the marriage was over. The discovery also meant that the fairy tale she had allowed herself to believe in, the real love, the stable family, the daily presence she had always wanted, had been built on foundations that weren't there. The divorce proceedings were painful in proportion to how much the marriage had meant to her. She retained primary custody of Athena and committed herself to raising her daughter with the hands-on, present, everyday kind of motherhood that she herself had never received. She told people she didn't care about anything except Athena. By all accounts, she meant it. She was also, by this point, in serious health decline. The years of extreme dieting, the cycling between rigid self-denial and overeating driven by depression, the dependency on prescribed medications that had been building since her early 30s, all of it had taken a measurable toll. Her weight continued to fluctuate dramatically. Her heart was under strain that doctors who examined her found concerning. Those who spent time with her in the final years described someone who could still be funny and warm and sharp, but who was also clearly diminished from whoever she had been before the grief, before the marriages, before the long accumulation of loss. The last chapter. In November 1988, Christina Onassis traveled to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to visit friends at an exclusive country club called Tortuguitas, approximately 20 miles outside the city. She had been spending more time in Argentina, which had always held a particular significance for the Onassis family. It was where Aristotle had begun his transformation from immigrant to tycoon, and it carried the memory of origins that connected Christina to a version of her father before he became the impossible legend. On the morning of November 19th, 1988, her maid found her in the bathroom of the villa where she was staying. She was 37 years old. She was gone. The autopsy results were complex and have remained subjects of ongoing discussion in the years since. The official cause of death was a heart attack caused by acute pulmonary edema, the same condition that had killed her mother 14 years earlier. The official finding was that there was no evidence of suicide, no evidence of foul play. There were large quantities of barbiturates found in her system, specifically a sedative called optalidone that she had been prescribed. Whether the drug levels were the cause of the cardiac event, or a coincidence of her existing prescription, remained an open question that medical examination did not fully resolve. A private Greek Orthodox funeral was held on November 20th, 1988, at a chapel on Skorpios. She was buried in the Onassis family plot on the island she had known since childhood, alongside her father and her brother. 3 generations of an extraordinary family, all gone before their time, all lying under the same Ionian sky. Her estate, worth approximately $250 million at the time of her death, was left entirely to Athena. The little girl who had been the great love of Christina's final years was 3 years old. She would be raised in Switzerland by her father, Thierry Roussel, and his wife, Marianne Landarch. She would grow up with the Onassis fortune and the Onassis name, and very little of the life her mother had wanted to give her. The empire and the woman who ran it. There is a version of the Christina Onassis story that is easy to tell and that misses almost everything important about her. In that version, she is a tragic heiress, overweight, addicted, unlucky in love, stumbling through 4 doomed marriages while the money piled up around her. It is a version that the tabloids loved and that the people who actually knew her found reductive to the point of dishonesty. The reality was that Christina Onassis ran a shipping empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars from her mid-20s until her death. She negotiated directly with governments. She managed a fleet of tankers on which entire economies depended. She made financial decisions that her father's own advisors, men who had been skeptical of her from the beginning, came to describe as shrewd. One of her earliest significant moves as sole owner was to charter those Soviet shipping contracts through Sovfracht, that everyone around her told her were commercially and politically inadvisable. They turned out to be enormously profitable. She settled Jacqueline Kennedy's claim on the estate, a claim that under Greek law could have been worth as much as $125 million, for approximately $26 million, through negotiation that her lawyers described as skillful, and that those who had underestimated her found surprising. She also paid less in estate taxes than virtually anyone had predicted, through an adroit use of legal structures that demonstrated a financial intelligence her father would have recognized immediately. She kept the empire running. It was not always glamorous work, and it was never simple work, and she did it while simultaneously managing her marriages, her health, her public image, and the accumulated grief of 3 family deaths before she was 25. She was also a woman who had lost her entire immediate family in 29 months, at an age when most people's families are still intact, who had been photographed and commodified since birth, who had been used as a pawn in her parents' dynastic calculations and her father's social ambitions, and who had spent her adult life being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that she was not quite beautiful enough or thin enough or charming enough for the world she had been born into. She was a woman who paid people to spend time with her because the money was easier to offer than the vulnerability of simply asking. Her stepsister, Henrietta Gelber, said of Christina that what she had been striving for was just to be a normal human being with normal family relationships, and that in her situation, that had been virtually impossible. The wealth that was supposed to represent the ultimate form of security had been the thing that made security most elusive, because every relationship it touched was complicated by its presence. Every man who wanted her was potentially a man who wanted the empire. Every friend who was loyal to her might be loyal to the money. She had said as much in her more candid moments, and the people around her had no convincing way to argue otherwise. She had 4 husbands and 1 child. The husbands could not hold. The child was the one thing that was entirely hers. And the divorce from Roussel had separated them just enough that the life she had planned for Athena, the daily, ordinary life of a present and constant mother, was already compromised by the time she died. Athena would grow up in Switzerland, raised by Roussel and the woman who had been his parallel family throughout his marriage to Christina. She would inherit an estate worth approximately $250 million at age 18. And she would grow up not quite knowing the woman who had named her after her grandmother, and then died before Athena could form a clear memory of who she had been. The name on the side of the family yacht, the private island, the tankers crossing the world's oceans. She had inherited all of it and managed it and kept it moving through a decade of personal turmoil that would have derailed anyone with less natural resilience. She had done the work of an empire, and she had spent every night of her adult life looking for something that the empire was not equipped to provide. She died at 37, younger than her father had been when he was just beginning to build what she eventually inherited. The island of Skorpios holds them all now: Aristotle, Alexander, Christina, the 3 people at the center of a dynasty that rose out of a poor Greek boy's arrival in Argentina in the 1920s and ended in the same generation that began on a Manhattan delivery table in December 1950, on a quiet morning in Buenos Aires that the world wasn't expecting. The empire continued after her. The tankers kept crossing the oceans. The foundation her father had established in Alexander's name kept funding the arts and scholarship it had been set up to support. The name Onassis remained one of the most recognizable names in the world, but the family that had made the name, the actual people, with their grief and their ambition and their longing for ordinary connection, was gone. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.